Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. Prime Minister Narendra Modi paid tribute to former Japanese Premier Shinzo Abe during the state funeral in Tokyo on Tuesday. Attended by representatives from over 100 countries, the state funeral was the first for a former Prime Minister in 55 years, with flowers, prayers and a 19-gun salute. Following the funeral, Prime Minister Modi also had a private meeting with Mrs. Akie Abe, during which he recalled his fond memories with Abe San and conveyed his heartfelt condolences on the tragic loss. Earlier, the Prime Minister also conveyed his deepest condolences to his counterpart, Mr. Fumio Kishida, over the sudden demise of Mr. Shinzo Abe, underlining the late Japanese leader's contributions in strengthening the bilateral partnership, as well as his vision of a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. As a tribute to the friend of India, we look back at how Shinzo Abe advanced India-Japan ties and the contours of our relations post his demise. Joining us with their perspectives are three eminent panelists on the program. So let me begin first by introducing them to you. With me in the studio is Professor Shrabani Roy Chaudhary, Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, JNU. Professor, thank you for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV. And joining us virtually is Mr. Professor Rajiv Shaw, Director, India-Japan Laboratory, Kyoto University, Japan. Professor Shaw, thank you for your time. And also pleased to have Dr. Sriram Cholia. He's a foreign affairs expert. Dr. Cholia, glad to have you on this edition of Perspective. Let me begin the program, Professor Chaudhary, with you, since we are, paying tribute to the late Japanese premier who happened to be India's great friend, and the Prime Minister himself has gone to Tokyo to pay tribute. How do you look back at the legacy of Mr. Shinzo Abe, especially in the context of India-Japan bilateral relationship?
Shinzo Abe took over as the premier first time round is the time when securitization of East Asia became important because of the rise of China. The aggressive stand that China took over a period of time focused Abe's attention to our country more because he was looking for a friend and our country has all the strengths that goes for having a friend. We don't have a historical baggage. We are militarily very strong. We have a good economic partnership that is shaping up in our country. So I think all these fundamental pillars sort of pointed towards making our relationship stronger. And Abe did not lose any points in trying to make it converge into a strategic relationship, which really, the trajectory that it walked has been tremendous for India because we never had such a great outing with any other country other than Japan. We are in their 2+2 ministerial dialogue. Today we have a summit meetings which have started in 2014. So there is a lot that has happened during his legacy. And I think it would always be difficult for anyone to really surpass him in the near future with respect to, because he himself had a longer term domestically as a prime minister. In fact, he's the longest serving prime minister of Japan. So I think these could be fundamentally the reasons why we as a country have been able to forge a relationship which is, as both Abe and Modi said, the most consequential relationship of this century.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Shinzo Abe, Professor Shaw is credited with, accelerating the pace of India-Japan relationship in the last couple of years or so. What are some of the significant contributions that you see in terms of elevating India-Japan relationship to a level that was never seen before?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me bring you back a little bit before Shinzo Abe came, and from my own personal perspective. I came in Japan in 1994, so 28 years back. 1995 was a very critical year of the India-Japan relation for two reasons. 1995, we had one major earthquake in Kobe, where a huge amount of Indian population lived. And lots of Indian people, actually, they helped in Kobe. And then in March, we had a sarin gas attack in Tokyo subway, which actually made a little bit of strange feeling about Indians in the suburban Tokyo area. But then, of course, as we all know, that 98 Pokhara, 98 to 2000, possibly a cold period. And then from 2007 onward, when Prime Minister Abe's first visit and that legendary speech in the parliament, I think that possibly changed quite a bit. I'm not a foreign policy expert, but to me, I think that the bilateral relation has three specific aspects. One is, of course, the diplomatic, political, and the defense-related thing. The second one is possibly the trade and business, economic cooperation, science, technology, innovation. And the third and most important one is the people's connectivity, which is possibly the culture, education, food, movie, music, and so on. So what we see is that Abe and Modi has brought this whole country's relation to the new level of these first two pillars, diplomatic, political defense, as well as trade, business, economic cooperation. And possibly this is just one way. There is no return from that due to different geopolitical context. But possibly still where we need to do more is the third pillar, which is the people's relation and the people's connectivity. Possibly I will come back to this issue a little bit later, but that's the area we definitely need to work very strongly.
Absolutely. So I'll come back to you in the sense of understanding which are the areas wherein India-Japan relationship has to further explore newer avenues. But let me bring in Dr. Cholia's perspective. And since you mentioned how it was Modi-Abe bonhomie that has worked wonders for the India-Japan relationship, Dr. Cholia, if you could give us a sense of how significant are personal relationships, personal chemistry when it comes to elevating bilateral relationships. We've seen how Prime Minister Modi on several occasions has mentioned Mr. Abe as a great, true friend of India, and the significant aspect that he himself has flown to Tokyo to pay personal tribute alongside several other world leaders. How significant is the aspect of personal chemistry between bilateral relationships of two countries, according to you?
They do matter insofar as if there is a convergence of interests and if the top leaders have a friendly bond. In fact, Modi and Abe, it was called a bromance, and it was probably the most lasting and consequential bromance. The reason this helps is because, Japan, India had a strategic and global partnership even before Modi and Abe.
Right.
But we elevated it to special strategic and global partnership. And if you look at the investment volumes, FDI from Japan to India, they shot up like threefold, or in some years even went up fourfold after Prime Minister Modi and Abe got closer and indicated to their respective bureaucracies and to the lower level officials that they prioritize this at the highest level and that they want this relationship to flourish and go even better. So I think those signaling from the top matters a lot. And of course, I think new ideas, innovative forms of cooperation have come. It's not just FDI and trade which have improved. You look at the defense component. I mean, the way in which we have moved. Now we have even signed a reciprocal logistics agreement of the two militaries. We have the 2+2, as my co-panelist mentioned. So the defense component has come a far way because of Shinzo Abe. Had he not been there, you can imagine the Japanese polity is kind of bureaucratic and slow and conservative, but he was what I call a radical conservative. And he wanted drastic change in the Japan's foreign policy, in its defense posture and its military alignments. So as a result of that, if you do a counterfactual and suppose there was no Shinzo Abe, we would have had 1 or 2 year, revolving door in Japanese politics. No prime minister lasted more than 2 years before Abe San came in. So what he did was create that space for stable and long-term planning. And that's where Prime Minister Modi came in. They were, birds of a feather flock together. And that's why they got so close, because Prime Minister Modi also wanted a long-term strategic approach to Indo-Pacific. And we all know that had it not been for Modi and Abe, there would be no Quad revival, there would be no Indo-Pacific that
Absolutely.
we talk about. Because earlier it was just the Americans who were talking about Indo-Pacific.
That's a significant point, Professor Cholia. Let me hear what Professor Chaudhary has to say on that defense aspect. Professor Chaudhary, it's true that initially Japan was averse to having a defense and security cooperation with India. It's only under Abe that we've seen how, especially in this area, we've enhanced our relationship. Do you think because Mr. Abe was visionary was one aspect, or also because of the fact that Mr. Cholia mentioned, the fact that he brought about stability, and that is what helped enhance relationships, not just with India, but the vision that he had for the developing world?
You have to go back to look, when you look at the defense sector of Japan, the story begins with the fact that it has an Article 9 embedded in its constitution, which talks about disarmament of Japan, basically because of the Second World War. Given that various prime ministers at various point of time has nudged that article such that they could involve some amount of defense. It started with having a self-defense force way back. And what Abe did was to center stage the defense sector by, one, getting the National Security, Strategic Security Council in place. He put in the action he took towards arms export, which essentially gave defense sector a certain position. Having got the domestic agenda in place and improving the political theater in Japan to accept a little more of defense consciousness, it was very natural for him to look out for more defense partnership, because remember, it's aggressive China that he's basically trying to counter. And India, having proved itself in its maritime security, we have to go back to know that one of Japan's ship which got into the piracy issue, India was one of the naval outreach through which India cooperated to bring the business, the commercial ship back into the folds of maritime security, was one reason why Japan definitely started taking interest in our maritime capabilities. And I think over a period of time, this is one sector that Abe wanted to have a larger defense cooperation. And there are various pillars on which we have agreed. We do multilateral engagement with them, the Malabar exercise being one of it. We also do many trilateral engagement. And it is these kind of engagements which India promoted during this phase, which actually led to the coming back of or revival of Quad, as we call it. So I personally think that as far as Abe was concerned, he had a focus and he had a determination which was visible as he walked the road as a prime minister, and he never really moved away from his vision of wanting to make Japan a more politically and strategically more engaging partner, rather than using only economic parameters to engage itself with the rest of the world. Absolutely. So that is where he went.
You're right. I mean, perhaps it's because of this transformative vision that he had that he is today only the second premier in Japan to be accorded the state funeral, albeit, but of course, there are certain state protests by groups of people there. But the fact that this leader who had a vision and brought about stability, longest serving prime minister, is something because of which he's been recognized. Dr. Cholia, let me come back to you, and sorry to have interrupted you earlier on, but this is one aspect on the Indo-Pacific that I want your opinion on. Mr. Abe is remembered as the architect of the Indo-Pacific policy, and he saw New Delhi at the heart of this policy. Part one of the question, how did he have that confidence in India? How did he look at India, playing a central role when it comes to his Indo-Pacific vision? And part two is, now with him gone, can the current leadership live up to the expectations, live up to the vision that Mr. Abe had regarding the Indo-Pacific?
Tina, how did Shinzo Abe come up with the Indo-Pacific vision? He comes from a background of nationalistic politicians who wanted to break the shackles of the US-imposed Pacific Constitution and the pacifism that came after World War II, the US occupation. So he wanted to shake off a lot of the restrictions. And that's where he started looking at other partners and other pillars of support over and above the United States. Because the traditional Japanese doctrine was, we just rely on the US for our security. They provide us with the umbrella, both during the Cold War, even after the Cold War, even despite the Chinese threat, they had a belief that they just need to piggyback on the US. And of course, they host a large number of American troops and bases even now. But I think Shinzo Abe realized that it has to be US plus. And there he looked around, and it was quite clear, because the question of the credibility of US security commitments in Indo-Pacific was quite clear. And so he wanted actually regional partners. And that's a great innovation of Shinzo Abe, because he really pushed for regional groupings, or what he called broader Asia. He was looking at not just in Asia of South Korea and Japan and Philippines and a few other treaty allies of the US. He was looking to broaden the coalition, because he was one of the very early people who realized that the Chinese were going to come at all the smaller countries with an expansionist and hegemonic vision. So I think he looked at India as one of those critical linchpins through which Japan can actually become, quote unquote, a normal country again, after breaking free from the old self-imposed and the US imposed restrictions. What happens after Shinzo Abe? I will say that it is a very difficult shoe to fill. Already Yoshihide Suga came in and he left very quickly, and now we have Fumio Kishida, and he may be struggling with the opinion polls a bit already with public opinion. So I think the kind of aura and charisma and ability to carry large amounts of bureaucracies and as well as public opinion that Shinzo Abe had is going to be difficult to replace. But the vision that he set is still continuing. He has institutionalized a lot of changes. For example, the goal Fumio Kishida has announced, the current prime minister, 2% GDP spending on defense. This was the ideal because earlier Japan was not doing that. They were just depending on the US. So now this kind of self-reliant Japan with those multiple partners, especially with India in the center, I think that is going to continue, but you need consensus building in Japan. You always have to carry along many factions within the ruling party, as well as a public opinion, which is usually very conservative and not in favor of drastic changes. So I think it will require a lot of fresh leadership to come in and take this forward. But I think they are committed to this now. They have going to spend more on defense. They want to be involved in Southeast Asia. Japan has become very proactive on supporting Taiwan as well. Earlier, it was hesitant. And Japan is calling out China on other issues, such as human rights and situation in Xinjiang and Tibet and all that. So I think Japan is very clear now, whether or not there are shifts in the US policy to the region, it needs to have its own kind of an alliance system or a coalition of its own, which is endogenous to Asia, to the Indo-Pacific. And ultimately, we are the people who will have to balance in Asia, right? Because the US may or may not come in, or it depends on what kind of leadership changes happen in the US. During the Trump era, the Japanese were very worried. Shinzo Abe tried very hard. And that's why I think he's moved in this direction. And this is irreversible. But there could be setbacks because of instability. The old bogey of Japan is instability. And if it comes back, then there may not be continuity of policy and long-term strategic planning for geopolitics. And that is always a fear, but we will hope for the best.
Okay, let's see what Professor Shaw has to add to that in terms of instability and the challenges within Japan, Professor Shaw. So there are certain changes that Japan has announced that it is set to undergo in the times to come. But in terms of the challenges, the domestic challenges that Dr. Chollier spoke about, how difficult do you think it is for the current leadership in Japan?
Thank you very much. I must say that I agree with my fellow panelists about the legacy, how it happened, and there is no doubt about that. And this was very interesting when I was hearing to other two panelists, like how you see this relation from Indian perspective. But for me, living in Japan for last 28 years, I see possibly a different perspective. And I give you a few facts. Japan has close to 2.6 million foreigners. Chinese population is 800,000, followed by Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, Brazil, even Nepal. And India has 40,000 people, like Indians who are living in Japan. When I came in 94, it was around 4,000. So yes, tenfold increase, but is that enough? Foreign students in Japan is 300,000. And out of that, Indian students are 1,800. When I came as a student, it was 300. Yes, sixfold. Is that enough? But also look at the other flow. Like we know that how much Japanese investment in going to India, but still Japanese residents who are living in abroad are 1.4 million, out of which 400,000 live in US, 120,000 live in China. But in India, it's mere 10,000. So are these numbers is a real reflection of the India-Japan relation? Or I will say the potential of India-Japan relation? Are we able to really make full use of this particular relation? I will say possibly no. You see, then when you talk about China, like yes, China-Japan relation has changed quite a bit, but still China, Korea, and Japan's relation is very much rooted in language, food, fashion, music, movie, tourism, education, and so on. If you think about US-Japan relation, in spite of what happened in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, still, I will say food, fast food mainly, fashion, music, movie, tourism, education again. But I think in India-Japan relation, even if we just talk about defense relation, diplomatic ties, foreign relations, and so on. My main point is that unless it is rooted into people's relationship, just only one prime minister cannot change this particular future. But I see huge potential. Yes, there are numbers which are increasing, but I think, as our fellow panelists have rightly pointed out, there are many different challenges in the Japanese politics, Japanese economic condition, Japanese cultural changes, which we are seeing. I see a good potential, but possibly we are not using it fully. I mean, that will be my main emphasis.
Okay, Professor Chaudhary. So he's right. Across an entire gamut of sectors, we've been able to enhance our partnership over the years. But people-to-people connect is somewhere we still need to work upon. What are the factors that are proving to be stumbling blocks when we talk about enhancing people-to-people connect between India and Japan? And how can we harness the potential, as Professor Shaw rightly mentions? So in the times to come, what exactly needs to be done to ensure that this doesn't remain a concern?
Let's begin with tourism, because tourism is one of the easiest thing to do with respect to two countries, because nothing really inhibits a person from going and visiting a country other than the visa conditions, which has improved tremendously with passage of time with Japan. However, Indian tourism is really focused on the Western world because you feel more exposed to the Western world. Colonialism is the reason why you probably still want to go and see London. But we don't have, though we have historical connect, it has not been explored to the extent that people feel the urge of going to Japan and seeing Japan. Japan on the rebound, I think, with tourism has always been trying to show the mystic front, which actually captures the Western audience. Indians are not captured by the mystic. They have to see the contemporary Japan, or as I always say, show Shibuya and Shinjuku to them, and you will see more Indians probably wanting to venture out. Also, I think our mindset of Indian tourism is pretty different. We are a family tourist rather than couple tourism, which is much more common among the Westerners. And therefore, it requires to be, Japan needs to field it as a family tourism. So you have to mix in something for the children, something for, and that is where I think work has begun, because I do see advertisements pre-COVID where they used to say Disneyland and Yokohama, SeaWorld, etc. So the work, and I think it's the tourism which actually encourages further development in people-to-people connect, especially with education. Because once, as a tourist, as a young child, you visit a country, you might be enthralled by it to go back to study out there. We have had progress, as you know, the numbers do say a lot, but then, when it is a comparative number, then you realize that you're not too much in that front. And language definitely has been a barrier for a long time, but I think technology, to a great extent, is taking care of it. We saw it during the Olympics, how you had those apps which could easily translate for you. I think those are going to be encouraging, reference points for people to look at Japan as a tourist, and therefore as also, I feel, in an educational form. Japan is doing a lot of good work with respect to, having many outlets for actually learning the language, either through online or offline. And I think special interest by Indian government has also been taking place to create more centers of language learning in Japanese. Because, when you compare with China, Korea, we must realize that there is certain amount of language comfort, because the kind of, the script that they use is pretty similar, etc. Whereas for us, India, because we have a second language as English, which is spoken in the Western world throughout, you move west from India, anywhere you can get by speaking English, is probably an hindrance when it comes to education. Whereas I think in technical education or the STEM subjects, I think there has been sizably more number of students from India going there.
The underlying fact that more needs to be done in the times to come when we talk about strengthening people-to-people connect. So, Dr. Cholia, I'll come to you for one last statement, because time allows me to take only one concluding remark. We've spoken about, Mr. Shinzo Abe's legacy, the India-Japan relationship trajectory over the years, and the challenges within the domestic Japanese politics as well. And apart from that, the people-to-people connect is one area where trust needs to be put upon by both sides. But where do you see the future of India-Japan relationship evolving now that, Mr. Abe is no more? We've seen two quick prime ministers since Mr. Abe stepped down, and the fact that, it can't be a one-sided effort. So even if India invests too much into, into Japan in terms of blossoming our relationship further, the fact that it has to reciprocate just like Mr. Abe did, Japan has to also see India as that significant partner that Mr. Abe did. So in terms of that, how do you look at India-Japan relationship now evolving post-Abe?
There is a kind of a multi-partisan consensus in Japan across the spectrum that India matters. But the kind of weightage that Shinzo Abe brought to India relationship was unheralded, unprecedented. So I think that way to expect that to happen now as Japan still handles its domestic problems, maybe being too over optimistic. But in the medium to long term, I think the Japanese strategic future lies with India, and they're quite clear about it. And both in the foreign ministry, in the across the civil service and the military, and hopefully the people as well, which of course is a lacuna, I agree. We'll see. I think the idea is that this is an indispensable relationship, because otherwise we can't have balance of power in Asia. You see, and Indo-Pacific, we have willed it into reality. It's a construct that Abe San himself created. And I think we owe it to him, the generations to come, to build this relationship to unprecedented levels where, it's actually de facto alliance. And that's what we want. We want closer and closer interoperability. Now, Japan is also talking about being a player in India's defense market. There's co-production. They want to co-manufacture. If South Korea can become a player in India's defense market, why not Japan? These are new players that are coming in. I think in the long run, the Japanese companies here, there are nearly 1,500 of them in India. They are the real bridges. And Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe worked very hard on building the business-to-business linkages. And as long as those remain, Prime Minister Modi removed all the hurdles. He created a single window clearance for Japanese investment. That's how we have reached this level now. So this is the role model relationship. We would need to replicate this with other smaller countries in Asia, like Vietnam and Indonesia, which are lesser in economic size than Japan. But Japan is the ideal Indo-Pacific partner, and that's how we have to keep on nurturing this with the top level involvement at the levels of prime ministers. And I'm sure the Prime Minister Modi, he has worked with many successions and transitions, whether it is Trump or Biden, whether it is Abe or Kishida. He is clear that this is our number one or most preferred partner, and we will go to any lengths to remove all the hurdles and to take it to the highest possible level.
Absolutely. In terms of the vision and the impact that Mr. Shinzo Abe had, it was absolutely, unprecedented, phenomenal, as you, rightly mentioned. But the true tribute to Dr. Abe would be with the kind of vision that he had in terms of elevating India-Japan ties and some of these hurdles that have to be surmounted with time that all the panelists have spoken about. So time is running out. That having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Perspective, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have you on the program today. So viewers, thank you for your time as well. That's it from us on this edition of the program. I'll see you same time tomorrow now. Until then, take good care of yourselves and keep watching Sansad TV.